Farron had never been backed into a corner like this before. The crushing weight of death had never loomed so close to her, and it was a feeling she never wanted to experience again. They had dropped onto Perthen in good order, standard procedures going without a hitch, and came down just in time to help push back a Mandarin offensive. The Mandarin had become quite jittery with the looming war wave only a few standard void weeks away, and their raids had become more impulsive, more violent, more desperate. The rumor was that they were searching for some old weapon, one that they already knew about, according to one of the rare chances High Command was able to catch a prisoner alive. The Zumra were doing their part in cracking these Mandarin prisoners, splitting open the truths from their minds like a plier to walnut. The humans were growing quite tired of these troublesome space elves, as well as their near-zealot-level hatred of the Nimikian point allies that fell under human purview. Frerin, perhaps out of everyone, hated them most of all. Their nearly purple skin tone and blood-red eyes instilled inside of Frerin a kind of hatred she had never felt before, one that never failed to creep up into her veins when she popped out of her drop pod to the sight of them. That near-feral loathing was riding on her skin like a parasite as she stared out past her crystal shard-laden cover, her helmet still pipped into her ear with a little every couple of minutes, reminding her that her armor was 52% compromised and that she was out of both injections and painkillers. The new blue crystals were embedded so much into her armor plating that she thought she looked like a hoodoo doll, a kind of magical item found on Earth. She had lucked out catching these new crystals mostly in the thick parts of her armor, but she was not unscathed. Out of 400 heavy assault and light infantry drop troopers, only 150 still stood. The rest were either dead or wounded, staged up in a landing port behind the little ragged line of survivors. Himmel and Zetrin were both wounded, the point having caught a glancing blow to the helmet, and the Karlaken having sustained so many wounds he simply ran out of blood to function properly. Himmel's helmet had burst open into a cloud of shards when a blue crystal slammed into it, but the helmet had done its job, sparing the point of losing his head. Himmel would have to thank the lucky stars above that he still had a head between his pointed ears. Zetrin had been in the thick of the melee during the last push, counting aloud in Karlake and Hazra as he butchered Mandarin regulars with other members of his kind. Despite his battle fever, all bravado falls in the face of blood leaking from the body. The last she had seen of him, he was hooked up to nearly 4 bottles of replacer. The whole combat had been a battle for survival after they routed the raiding party, which had clearly just been a damned lure. Mandarin raiding cutters had folded onto the battlefield, a risky maneuver judging by the amount of cutters having folded into trees and buildings, exploding with bone-rattling concussions of their folding cores erupting. The big mouth bass was in its own fight for survival with multiple UAS destroyers and 3 EC frigates, while the cutters had folded planetside dozens of Mandarin lancers and Chasserine renders had folded in beside the human fleet. Even now, if Frerin looked up, she could see the readouts of fighters dueling to death above her, and the shine of C-beams glittering through the void of space. C-beams were terrifying machinations of human science, powered by their own fusion engines. The beams traced an arc of pearly white light through space, then pulsed amber streaks of energy that were capable of blowing a bus-sized hole through armor plate and shield alike. The worst part is that they were beautiful to behold, entire batteries filling the black background of space with dazzling lights. They were actually audible in space, the sound akin to broken glass being dashed against crystals. The duel in the sky meant no support could be dropped. They had tried to drop ammo, but Mandarin fighters either suicide rushed them or fired on them, blowing them apart and causing them to burn in atmo. The Mandarin desperately wanted a victory, to prove to themselves and their people that they were better than humans, and they had sprung a trap to both decimate their ground troopers and attempt to decimate their ships. While 150 stood strong, the rest of them were hoping for a medevac. Frerin took a moment to blink through her visor menu, pulling up a roster of dead. Only 110 dead, Frerin said aloud to herself, her voice carrying over her helmet's communication speaker to those around her, more because she knew a lot of them lacked helmets at the moment. Could be a lot worse. A male human trooper named Cornell shrugged his shoulders, his dusky, toned face wrapped with bandages, as well as covering one of his stricken eyes. Gonna be a whole lot worse if they get through us. I'd be more comfortable with another 100 up here, and not back there. Fat chance, another human said, though his voice was slightly distorted due to his helmet's microphone. The medics ran out of blood sachets nearly 10 minutes ago. Whoever bleeds out next is gonna end up watering the plants as their last action alive. A female human chuckled through her microphone. What a charming thing to say, Michelle. It's Michele. I know you know this. I've told you more than enough times. Farron spoke into her microphone again while turning to the two humans. Children, please. If I am going to die, I'd like it to be sans bickering. Tittering laughter filled both the air and her inner ear receiver, and she smiled. Yeah, you tell 'em, Arun. One of the last few standing Yorpal replied, and Farron's smile faltered. That was a male, green-furred, she thought, and there was a red-furred male somewhere else down the line. Around Farron were the last three females of pink, black, and red fur. Among the 150 were a few of the Point, Carlaken, and Jin, but that still left over 100 humans to face the line. As Farron turned to observe the three remaining female Yorpal, they all turned their helmeted heads to her. Farron stared at them silently, leaning against her empty XC1 like it was a cane, and the red-furred one spoke up. Is there something wrong, Arun? She asked, taking off her snouted helmet with a light hiss and running her fingers through her fur. This female Yorpal was a veteran, even bearing a scar across her snout, and her paws did not shake like the others. Farron stared at the Yorpal with her tired pink eyes, not taking off her helmet in response. Are you three doing all right? As best as we can be doing, she replied, draining the last of her auxiliary canteen bladder. Black on water now. All I have left is the inner plate reserve. Count yourself lucky, the black-furred Yorpal said, her mic clicking on with an audible thud due to the damage it sustained. Mine got pierced by a crystal round. It's been leaking down my suit the entire damn time we've been out here. The pink Yorpal chuckled, taking off her helmet with another small hiss. You may want to shower later if we make it out of here alive. I heard the male humans are not fond of wet dog. Odd, here I thought they enjoyed it. The black-furred Yorpal replied dryly, the pink and red Yorpals sniggering to themselves. Quinlan, you're so gross. The red-furred Yorpal muttered. Corporal Farron is going to have to tie you down with a leash, judging from what I keep hearing. Promises, promises, Quinlan said loftily, and even this garnered a grin from Farron. As long as you both make sure you're clean, I don't want any fatalities. Farron muttered into her mic, her smile audible in her words. At the same time, don't embarrass me by becoming a rewe kwabing kahwai. Corporal! Quinlan blurted out with a laugh, flushing with embarrassment as the pink and red-furred Yorpals spluttered with teasing giggles. Their laughter and shared moment of pause was ruined by the sudden of an alert hitting their helmets, and Farron looked up at her visor. Despite the battle above them in the stars, a frigate was still doing its best to watch over them and track enemy movement. The alert showed them a live thermal map, and a final charge was heading their way. Shit! Farron muttered, baring her teeth. Looks like they're out of ammo too, and are coming in to finish the job. She was tired, bone-tired, but knew she could not lay her head down. If she did, she would be asleep and her brain attempting to cycle, and waking her up for a coming melee would have been akin to dragging a zombie from its grave and pushing it forward into the fight. All Yorpals, Point, Carlaken, and Jin had already gnashed their teeth through the supply of stimulant gummies, and her tank was running on empty.
Troopers of 3rd Company!
A call went out into the air, and Captain Shawnez was walking in front of their makeshift barricade.
The enemy comes to break upon us and die! Affix bayonets!
Farron saw the physical change in tone from the humans, and this particular command made her heart run cold. This command was more akin to a spell, a micro-story that told those receiving the command what to expect. Any trooper could place their bayonet onto their XC-1 rifle. That was more than known. But to be commanded to do it told a different story. The light infantry that had joined her drop pulled out their long bayonets and clicked them into place. The heavy assault troopers all instead pulled out their slammers, the power packs inside of the handles humming to life with a click of the arming switch. A lot of them hissed back to their starting positions, already stained with blood, flesh, bone, and hair.
The Mandarin come to eradicate us. All of them are in on this charge.
Captain Shaughness bellowed, his black hair dusty and blood-stained since his helmet had been blown off during a detonation. His armor was as bad as Freren's, and he looked like an angry, rave-colored porcupine.
We are the last line to the wounded. If we fail here, we all die.
Freren felt her body waning. Another battle, a final battle, and she was spent. Her visor told her she had been assigned a litany of humans under her command, and they were already making their way towards her.
I did not land on this planet to lose to these bastards. I refuse to let anyone end up in the hands of their altar. I expect the same feelings of you.
Captain Shaughness yelled, and a loud cheer echoed out to him from the line.
Bodies will be broken!
Captain Shaughness screamed, slapping his slammer against a nearby crate so it rang.
Blood will stain the ground! Valhalla's gates will open!
The thermal signatures were getting closer as Freren's humans gathered around her. It still tickled her, even now, how even the short ones were still taller than her and the other female Yorpal. Her humans were doing something odd, and the ones missing helmets were wide-eyed, teeth bared. Freren said to herself quietly, the thing. She wished she had the thing. Hell, she wished all Yorpal had the thing. She remembered talking with the other star citizens about the thing humans did, how they could tap into an energy within them. It was funny in a way. She and the others always called it something akin to magic, a power that could be pulled from the human body if the right spell was cast. Freren took in a deep breath, then looked to Captain Shaughness. It was up to him to summon the magic, to reach inside the humans and turn on their final drives. Captain Shaughness turned, pointing his slammer to the now visible forms of the Mandarin raiders and regulars coming their way, their glowing weapons shining as they ran.
Not one step backwards, not one more inch. If we die here, we die knowing we gave no ground and no quarter.
No ground, no quarter!
The humans all bellowed, and Freren saw the change happen. It wasn't even subtle. Eyes widened, teeth bared, energy soared within the body from some hidden dark place. This scared Freren, always did, but she had never felt this more raw form of fear before. She had seen it twice in videos, but never in real life, and she felt like a coyote standing amongst hungry grizzly bears. The humans were going to go feral, go berserk, as some called it. Freren could tell the non-humans by how tired they looked, how they looked around in confusion. Freren dug her fingers into her armor and suit, then pulled out the long steel chain that had the Tivas rune attached to it. She clutched it with her fingers, the arrow-shaped icon digging into her fur and flesh. "Help me," Freren whispered, her eyes widening as the scale of the Mandarin charge loomed fully into view. "Give this Yorpal strength, Tyr. Make me strong like your humans. I beg you." Even from the thermal readout, they were outnumbered 2-1.
The forge of battle roars before us.
Captain Shaughness howled, his back to the charging line as it loomed.
Steel will be tested.
Steel!
The humans boomed, slamming the buttocks of rifles and weapons against their cover.
Iron will be proven.
Captain Shaughness yelled defiantly, thundering his slammer onto another crate.
Iron!
The humans howled, and they all surged forward out of their cover, coming into battle line with Captain Shawnez.
Steel and iron!
All of the non-humans quickly clambered over cover to join them, and Frerin made sure to be in front of her own command of humans, even though her muscles ached and fear clawed at her heart as if it wanted to devour it. She could hear the mutterings of prayers from the other Yorpal, and the red-furred one appeared to be sobbing out of terror. The earlier mirth evaporated.
Let none say humans turn their heels to their allies. Let none say we gave ground.
Captain Shawnez roared in finality, and he began walking towards the mandarines that were only 100 yards away.
Let all say we died standing on our feet and charging the enemy. Steel and iron!
The animalistic war cry that filled Frerin's ears nearly caused her knees to buckle. The humans were ready to die, and they refused to know fear. The spell had been cast. She started screaming as well, hefting her slammer into the air as they all began to run. It was a sound that Frerin had never heard before outside of movies. The clash of two forces hitting each other. There was something primal about it. Something that sparked a genetic memory deep within her brain. The human battle line, bayonets flashing and hammers raised, did not just meet the Mandarine charge. No, it impacted the Mandarine charge, the unstoppable force meeting an object that failed to meet the same standard. The Mandarine may have been full of confidence, but they were too refined, too proper. They could not handle the weight of feral aggression, the power of humans knowing that death was coming for either them or their enemy. They lacked the magic that let humans do things no other star citizen was capable of doing. Adrenaline, knowing that the wounded were behind them, that they were the last line of defense, that they carried the legacy and honor of humanity on their shoulders. It turned the humans into monsters, and Frerin was front row to the spectacle. Specialist Rayburn, the cute little female human that had brushed her fur while watching Mulan, had her arm elbow deep into a male mandarine's mouth, choking him to death purely by the girth of her forearm, while she simultaneously slammed her thumb into the eye of a female mandarine that raised her gleaming energy sword. The female mandarine screamed in agony, dropping the sword and scrabbling her fingers at the ruined, ragged tendril of eye jelly and nerve that slapped against her cheek. Sergeant Nix, a man whom Frerin had personally seen coax a kitten from under a set of stairs while on Earth, ripped the jaw from a mandarin clean off, his soft face a mask of rage as an energy sword buzzed from within the flesh of his thigh. The mandarin, masters of duels, had expected something more formal. Instead, they were being snatched towards humans, hands gripping onto armor and using it as leverage so they could not get away. Bayonets dove into flesh with a ring of steel hitting bone. Slammers shattered arms with the impact of hissing strike faces, and Frerin spied even more eclectic weapons, boot knives, fighting daggers, tomahawks. Hell, she even saw one human wearing a pair of studded brass knuckles pummeling a mandarine so hard their face seemed to deform. Within the first 5 seconds, over 50 mandarine lay dead, maimed, mauled, or disfigured, and their charge came to a soul-shattering halt against the mass of humans. Even though they were long enough to wrap around the line of humans, they instead found themselves simply offering more targets to the humans in melee. Frerin ducked and weaved as best she could, turning and whirling her slammer around into knees, hips, and hands when she saw them. The Star citizens were doing their damnedest to give as best as they got, but they were being, thankfully, shown up by the humans. Frerin had to duck and roll along the ground to avoid Private Moose swinging a mandarine man around by his feet, using him as a weapon, even as blood flew through the air from the mandarine's broken face, As the Mandarin enveloped the melee, another war cry thundered in the air, and Frerin spun around, her lungs heaving in breath and arms shaking from exhaustion.
Steel and iron!
Mandarin fighters turned in panic to see the wounded humans surging out from the casualty collection point. Despite the fact some were missing entire arms and had massive crystals studded into their bodies, they surged through the pain, wielding slammer, bayonet, crutch, rebar, and even jagged pieces of metal quickly wrapped in duct tape. A large, black-skinned human that was blinded in both eyes was holding two large crate lids, and he turned to the two white-skinned humans behind him. "Steer me," he bellowed, and the two equally wounded humans aimed him like he was a missile.
Go, Carter!
One of them screamed, throwing down his crutch and limp running after the black human.
Go!
Carter, still wearing the shattered remnants of his combat armor, roared out a defiant challenge and sprinted at full speed toward the Mandarin, trying to surround the brawling human defense line. He split them apart like an axe through wood. Frerin heard the thundering boot falls of Carter and had to again duck out of the way, scrambling along the ground as Carter bounced off a larger Mandarin regular and went side-slipping through the melee, barreling into a furball of fighting bodies and being lost from view. A female Mandarin regular raised her energy spear, aiming it at Frerin as she came up onto her knees. But a crowbar, of all things, rang off the side of her head, throwing the Mandarin off balance.
"Oh, no, you fucking don't!"
A female human with bright lilac hair growled, hefting the crowbar like a sword and rolling her shoulders. This one wore the armor of the light infantry and had multiple neck wounds, and Frerin could see an air release needle stuck into her back, used to regulate sucking chest wounds. The human, running off of pure adrenaline and hatred, ducked a swing from the Mandarin, the air release needle giving a kss of air. The human stood, bringing the crowbar up as she did in a low swing, and rang the claw off the crowbar, off of the Mandarin's chin, tearing away a chunk of bone and shredding the flesh up to the eyebrow. Frerin brought up her weapon and slammed it into the knee of a Mandarin, the bone shattering wetly with a scream of the man who it belonged to, and he tumbled to the ground. A wounded female human was instantly upon him, crawling over him with a broken bayonet and digging the jagged tip into the man's throat as she screeched. A stolen slammer wielded by a female Mandarin clapped into the front of Frerin's chestplate, and the Yorpal went spinning through the melee, smacking roughly onto the ground and rolling as her helmet screamed out to her in alarm. Her breath came in rugged, guttural inhales as she crawled along the ground on her hands and knees, looking for her own slammer, as someone fell over her back, throwing her to the ground again. Her lungs screamed in agony, and her heart was thudding in her ears as she slapped her hand onto the slammer, dragging it towards her in halting inches as she gasped and wheezed for breath. The warning trills and beeps from her helmet were so loud that she pulled it from her head, exposing her mustard yellow fur to the air and tossing the helmet away as she still struggled to breathe. A partially burned human, the flesh of his face warped and mottled black like molten rock, helped Frerin to her feet, a blood-covered helmet in his hand. He had clearly used it to beat someone to death, judging by the dent and 3 teeth still embedded in the metal.
"Up you come, Corporal,"
he said, hauling Frerin up onto her feet as she took in another ragged breath.
"Not quite done here yet."
"Yes, Lieutenant,"
Frerin said with a painful squint to an eye, re-engaging her slammer with a crisp click and hiss of power.
"Onward ho ye go."
The human said with a dry laugh, hauling both Frerin and himself into the melee. The burned lieutenant proceeded to swing his helmet in wide arcs, smashing it off of arm, head, and chest, with comical tocks of shaped steel hitting bone. Frerin was gassed, and it took every ounce of her power to just swing her slammer, having to time the trigger correctly in order to do any damage at all. The body of the red Yorpal was on the ground, curled into a ball, and Frerin turned to the burned lieutenant.
I have to see if she's okay, sir.
The burned lieutenant nodded, and he slowly helped Frerin stumble their way towards the stricken Yorpal. The energy weapons of the Mandarin had fouled with all the blood and dirt, and it was now a truly medieval brawl. Humans were straight up taking the Mandarin, hand to hand, and more elbows than not bore the marks of impacts upon flesh. Humans were even wielding chunks of rock and broken armor, battering the Mandarin to death like cavemen of old. The Mandarin were not accustomed to this kind of savagery and were completely lost in how to respond once their weapons could no longer handle the strain. Frerin had to duck along with the burned lieutenant as a large human swung a broken XC-1MG like a baseball bat, battering a Mandarin whose energy spear kept flickering on and off due to the damage it had sustained.
Private Mossrat!
Frerin yelled out, falling down onto the Yorpal as the burned lieutenant came down onto a knee, his own adrenaline running low.
Mossrat, are you all right?
Frerin ripped off the Yorpal's helmet with a quick hiss of the seal. The Yorpal's eyes were wide, glassy, and her breath was coming in short, shallow breaths. Frerin looked into the display of the helmet and saw that her chest armor had been compromised.
Turn her over!
Frerin shouted, and the burned lieutenant nodded, rolling the Yorpal over. Private Mossrat had a high-pitched whimper and kicked her feet as her massive chest wound came into view. An energy spear had gotten through and at a downward angle, carving a hissing path through Mossrat's chest and stomach. The sight of Mossrat going into pre-death shock was the last straw for Frerin, and the last of her energy fled from her, buckling down onto Mossrat with finality and holding the Yorpal's head to her own.
Arun,
Private Mossrat whispered to Frerin, her voice so quiet that it likely took all the air in her lungs to make the words.
It's okay,
Frerin said, petting Mossrat's head.
It's okay. I'm here.
Mossrat's trembling hand pulled a silver cross out from the ruined hole of her armor, the chain broken by the heat of the energy spear.
Will he listen to me? Will he? Hush now,
Frerin murmured, pulling the Yorpal in tightly as the burned lieutenant placed a helmet over his head. Frerin kept running her hands through Mossrat's fur and down her ears, looking around and making sure no one fell on the dying Yorpal as the melee continued to rage.
They're retreating,
the burned lieutenant murmured, then looked up.
Supplies are coming.
Frerin spun her head around.
Supplies?
And reinforcements,
the burned lieutenant said with a nod of his head, then ripped off the helmet, summoning the last of his energy to bellow as loudly as he could, despite his twisted, wounded lips.
Brace for thunder!
Frerin wrapped herself tightly around Mossrat, the burned lieutenant wrapping himself around the both of them, and all the humans hit the dirt when they heard the sounds of reduction boosters split the sky. Dozens of Higgins 3 dropships slammed into the ground just behind the halted battle line, while yaks split through the sky, shattering the ground apart with their impacts and spitting out light infantry, cutting off the other Mandarin that had shown up to reinforce their struggling counterparts in the melee. The doors to the Higgins 3s slammed down to the ground, and the sprinting figures of 3rd Company's combat engineers spilled out like a hive of angry insects. Human combat engineers had their own heritage weapon, much like how the heavy assault troopers, like Frerin, had the slammers. Combat engineers had power-matics, the flat, spade-looking end being able to punch through any kind of surface to dig, and the wicked-looking spikes being energized so that they could punch through any kind of material. They were wicked-looking things that crackled with malicious energy and small arcs of light, and these combat engineers were pissed. Out of another Higgins 3 came nearly every other medic Frerin thought 3rd Company had, pouring out of their drop craft and hauling a trauma bag in each hand.
Dolebra, Milito!
A huge mountain of a human bellowed through his engineer's helmet. Theirs had a thick ridge above the T of their visor and a single-bladed apparatus on the side that allowed them to search for explosives with thermal and radiography scanners. An answering war cry echoed from the fresh combat engineers, and their Maddox found the Mandarin armor as tough as the soil they were made to toil in. A point medic slammed down next to Frerin, having tripped over the body of a dead wounded human, and didn't bother getting up. Instead, he pulled a trauma bag over and started digging through it, pulling out a 5-inch, thumb-thick needle and slamming it into the hamstring of Private Mossrat. "Just in time," the point said with a grin, as Mossrat gave a jerk, then screamed out into Freren's neck to muffle the noise. He turned, handing a large yellow canister to the burned lieutenant. "This is for you, sir." The burned lieutenant nodded, cracking the seal on the can to expose the short needle, then slammed it into the side of his neck.
Make sure we save who we can.
"Yes, sir," the point said, set down a quick response pack of 6 additional canisters, then took off at a run with the other medics. The burned lieutenant picked up one of the cans, letting out a sigh as the painkillers worked their way into his body. He sat down fully and watched the combat engineers slaughter the now retreating Mandarin. The Higgins 3 landing guns already opening fire on the incoming Corsair ships attempting to pick up survivors. He turned to Frerin, who was now petting the fully calmed down Mossrat, the drugs having slammed her pain receptors shut as the medical nano-healer started weaving her organs back together.
"Corporal,"
he said. Then tilted his head with a smile when Frerin didn't respond. He scooted a little closer, then tapped Frerin on the shoulder with the amber liquid-filled can, the other still holding his own to his neck.
"Corporal."
Frerin turned her head, her eyes wide and tired, and then down to the can.
"Ah, yes. Sorry, sir."
"Take your medicine. It'll make you feel better."
The burned lieutenant said with a chuckle, then tossed down his empty can, the nano-healers already attempting to chew away his burned, ruined skin. Frerin knew that he knew what he meant. As soon as she slammed that can into her body, she was going to fall asleep. One by one, all the surviving Yorpal that had been in the melee found Frerin, sat down next to her, and slammed their own can into their body. Quinlan and the pink Yorpal had survived, though they were heavily mauled, and Quinlan's arm looked broken in several places. Despite this, they slammed their cans into their flesh and promptly passed out on or next to Frerin, feeling comfort in knowing a Kawaii Arun was nearby to watch over them.
"I'm going to pass out when I use my can."
Frerin stated flatly, turning to look at the burned lieutenant with exhausted eyes.
"Is that okay, sir?"
The lieutenant chuckled.
"Permission granted. Here, let me get that can for you."
"Thank you, sir."
Frerin murmured, heard the human crack the seal on the can, then the sharp pain of the needle getting shoved into her skin.
"Rest now, Yorpal. You've earned your way."
The lieutenant murmured, and Frerin's eyelids drooped shut like bulkhead doors. Miss Rimmicky pulled up the brim of her large sun hat, relishing in the feeling of warm, natural sun and wind blowing across her skin. It was high time she got a vacation in, and there was no better place than Earth. Caden had, of course, joined her down on the planet's surface, and they were enjoying ice-cold gelato in a small resort city that rested within the Appalachian Mountains. She was overdue as it was, having been cooped up in that station for too long, and she wanted to feel a planet again. This trip had been wonderful so far. She had gone and seen all the waterfalls she could, gone hiking up and down the mountains with Caden, and he had somehow gotten both of them into an animal experience. Miss Rimmicky had heard of possums and raccoons, but had never had the ability to actually touch one yet. Caden not only got her into a rescue facility, but had also convinced the humans who ran it to let her touch and play with all the babies. Miss Rimmicky had spent several blissful hours holding, feeding, and playing with baby foxes, raccoons, bobcats, possums, and even at one point got to bottle feed a baby cougar. Despite her being a Zumra, the locals were extremely receptive of her, something she had not experienced in the larger cities. She still shuddered about that subway experience in New York, let alone the smell. They had decided to finish out their day at this little cafe, and as per usual, Caden was a glutton for attention. Caden opened his mouth and Miss Rimmicky rolled her eyes, giving him another spoonful of her cherry cheesecake gelato. Miss Rimmicky was about to open her mouth and receive a spoonful of mocha marshmallow gelato when a sudden cry from the other diners made both her and Caden look up and around.
Look! It's a battleship!
A waitress cried out, pointing up at the sky.
It's on fire! It's going to crash!
Miss Rimmicky took off her hat, her fronds curling out and idly twitching as she looked up into the big blue, squinting past the sunlight and fluffy clouds with narrowed eyes. Multiple combat ships were slowly gliding down through the atmosphere on their descending engines, meaning they were too damaged to even make it to the floating orbital ring. Even as they came down, shuttles and landing craft were splitting away from the main ship, hurtling towards hospitals. Even more curious was that damaged fighters were zipping through the sky with the destroyer. Fighters only did this when their docking mechanisms were damaged, meaning the fighting had been especially fierce and they had to ride. "Those are not battleships," Miss Rimmicky said as she pulled a data slate from her sling bag, bringing up the station news. "Those are destroyers. Battleships cannot handle the gravity of in-atmosphere maneuvers. They are, however, damaged." Caden set his hands on his hips, looking up as the smoke-trailing destroyers lumbered towards a repair dockyard. "Series 5 assault destroyers. We make those in space along with battleships on the dockyard ring. Looks like a major tussle with the Mandarin." "The battleships look worse for wear," Miss Rimmicky said, showing Caden the view of the naval dockyard. "They're sending down medical carriers with wounded. Looks like they are missing a lot of fighters, too." Miss Rimmicky tapped onto the slate a few more times, then pursed her lips prettily. "Salvage teams are already out there pulling out stranded pilots. Looks like the new survival pods you designed are working." "Means they're going to be calling for me soon," Caden grumbled, running a hand through his blonde locks. "Survival systems feedback and battleship damage overrides the vacation protocols for Tarim 1 master engineers. What's the point of having all this power if I can just get called back every time a battleship gets a boo-boo?" Miss Rimmicky raised an eyebrow at Caden, then bumped him with her hip. "Right. They don't let you get away with anything." Caden blew a raspberry, then held out his elbow. "Well, let's get going, I guess. No point in waiting around." "Nope. See? There's already a shuttle coming this way. At least my quarters on the ring are lavish. I even asked for an extra large tub to be installed." Miss Rimmicky grinned at him evilly. "I wonder why you would ever ask for such a thing."